He confronted the attack meant for the princess. Now the queen refuses to let him go. The blade was already moving before anyone in that hall understood what was happening. I saw it from across the room. A thin line of silver light, the kind that does not catch the eye unless you have spent enough years looking for exactly that kind of thing. The figure carrying it wore the pale gray uniform of a court attendant, and the way he moved was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not the kind of wrong that would make a trained Aethori guard turn his head, but wrong in the way that only soldiers recognize. The way a body moves when it is committed to a single irreversible action. I was standing at the back of the hall, which was where I had been told to stand. My orders were clear. Look professional. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not stare at the Aethori dignitaries. Do not, under any circumstances, embarrass the human coalition on its first official diplomatic visit to the Stellar Court. I had been managing all of those things reasonably well for about 40 minutes. My name is Marcus Hale. I am a sergeant in the Human Coalition Defense Corps, which is a long and impressive title for a man who had, until 6 months ago, spent most of his career doing things that never appeared in any official report. I was 34 years old. I had been in difficult places and come out the other side more times than I could count on 2 hands. I was not easily rattled. But standing in that hall, watching that figure move through the crowd toward the princess of the Aethori Stellar Empire, I felt something cold settle in my chest. The hall itself was extraordinary. I say that not as someone easily impressed, because I am not. But the Aethori Court of the First Sky was built in a way that made human architecture feel like an argument between children. The ceiling was open to the stars. Actual stars, not a projection, not a screen. The Aethori had constructed the entire building around a gap in the atmosphere, held in place by technology that I did not fully understand, and had been told not to ask about. Above us, 3 moons hung in a sky the color of deep ocean water, and around us, the most powerful beings in this corner of the galaxy stood in clusters of silk and light, speaking in low, musical voices that I could only partially follow. My Aethori was functional, not elegant. I had spent 4 months learning it because my commanding officer, Colonel Lawrence Webb, had told me it would make me more useful. He had been right, though I suspected he had not anticipated this particular situation when he said it. The Aethori were tall, taller than any human, with proportions that seemed slightly off to human eyes, as if someone had taken the idea of a person and refined it until it became something both familiar and completely alien. Their skin ranged in color from pale silver to deep amber, and their eyes were large and dark and caught light in ways that human eyes did not. They moved with a kind of effortless precision that made every human in the room look slightly clumsy by comparison. Princess Valereth stood at the center of the hall, surrounded by her personal attendants and a cluster of court officials. She was speaking with Ambassador Diane Porter, who led the human delegation and who was doing an admirable job of hiding how completely overwhelmed she was. I had spoken with Diane twice before this event. She was sharp, careful, and deeply committed to making this summit work. She did not deserve what was about to happen anywhere near her. The princess herself had barely acknowledged the human delegation's existence. She had offered the ambassador a formal greeting at the beginning of the evening, the kind of greeting that was technically correct in every way, and made you feel, somehow, as if you had been assessed and found mildly uninteresting. She was dressed in layers of blue and silver, and her expression throughout the evening had been perfectly composed, which in Aethori court culture apparently communicated either deep respect or complete indifference. I had not yet worked out which. I had been watching her out of professional habit. When you are assigned to protect someone, you watch the person you are assigned to protect. I had not been assigned to protect the princess. My assignment was limited to the human delegation, but I had been watching her because she was the most politically significant person in the room, and in my experience, the most significant person in any room is usually also the most interesting target. I had positioned myself poorly at first. The spot where the senior coalition aide had placed me gave me a good view of the human delegation and a partial view of the main doors. It was a good spot for someone whose job was to look ceremonial. It was not a good spot for someone whose instincts kept telling him that something in this room was not right. I had moved, quietly, during a shift in the crowd when the Aethori Chamber Orchestra began a new piece, and attention drifted toward the musicians. I had drifted instead toward the center of the room, finding a position near a structural column that gave me lines of sight in 4 directions. One of the coalition aides had shot me a sharp look. I had ignored it. That repositioning is the only reason I saw what I saw when I saw it. The figure in the gray uniform was 40 feet from the princess, then 30. The blade was inside a sleeve, standard concealment, but the arm was angled wrong, and every few steps the hand moved in a very small, very deliberate way. The way a hand moves when it is making sure an object is still exactly where it needs to be. I started moving before I had finished the thought. I want to be honest about what I was thinking in those seconds, because people have asked me since then, and I think they expect something dramatic. They expect me to say I calculated the angles and assessed the threat, and made a command decision. I did not do any of that. What I thought was, in this order, that someone was going to kill the princess, that no one else in the room had seen it yet, and that I was the closest person positioned to do anything about it. That was the entire thought. It took about half a second. Then I was moving. I covered the distance faster than was probably dignified. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the authority nearest me as I pushed through the outer edge of the crowd, because humans do not generally move through authority gatherings at that speed, or in that way, and I was apparently violating some number of social protocols that I did not have time to care about. The gray uniformed figure reached for the princess's shoulder with his free hand. It was a redirect, I understood immediately. He was going to turn her, expose the angle he needed, and then the blade would come up in a single motion. Phase disruption technology, the Coalition intelligence briefing had mentioned it, a weapon that worked by destabilizing the molecular bonds in living tissue. Painful beyond description, untraceable after the fact. Against authority physiology, almost immediately fatal. I stepped between them. I did not push the princess. I did not grab her or yell or do anything that might have caused a panic in the hall. I simply moved into the space the figure needed, and the blade came up, and it went into me instead of her. The sensation was not what I expected, which is to say I expected it to feel like being cut, and it did not. It felt like every nerve in the left side of my body tried to send a signal at the same moment, and the signals all contradicted each other. Hot and cold and sharp and dull, and everywhere and nowhere at once. My left arm stopped responding. My vision went white at the edges. I stayed on my feet for approximately 3 seconds, which I am told is unusual. Then my legs decided they had done enough for the evening, and I went down. I remember the sound the hall made. That enormous, star-ceilinged space had been full of quiet conversation and music, and the soft movement of hundreds of people. Then it was utterly silent, in the way that spaces go silent when something happens that no one has a framework for understanding. I remember seeing the floor, which was made of something that looked like dark glass, and reflected the moons above. I remember the gray uniformed figure being taken down by 3 authority guards who had finally processed what they were seeing, and responded with the kind of efficient, controlled speed that suggested they were very well trained and very angry about being caught off guard. I remember, very clearly, a pair of feet stopping in front of my face. Blue and silver fabric. The princess, crouching down, which was not something a member of authority royalty was supposed to do in public, based on everything the briefing documents had told me. She said something in authority that I only half caught, because my language processing was having a difficult moment. I believe it was a question, something along the lines of why, or perhaps what. The words were close enough to each other in formal authority that I could not be certain. I tried to answer. I am not entirely sure what came out. Something simple. Possibly just, it needed doing. Then the lights went out for me entirely. I woke up once during what I later learned was a 12-hour medical procedure, and I was immediately aware of 3 things. First, I was in a great deal of pain, but the kind of pain that exists at a distance, wrapped in medication, the way a sound exists through a closed door. Second, the room I was in was nothing like any medical facility I had ever been in. The ceiling above me was carved from something that shifted color slowly, and the light in the room came from sources I could not identify, warm and even, and very gentle. Third, there were at least 4 beings in the room who were not human, and they were all watching me with expressions that I could only describe as deeply uncomfortable. I tried to ask where I was. What came out was a sound that even I found embarrassing. I went back under. The second time I woke up, the pain was still there but much further away, and my mind was clearer. I was in a bed that was wider than my entire quarters back on the Coalition station, covered in something that felt like fabric and temperature at the same time, somehow both warm and weightless. The Authority physician standing at the side of the room was young, or appeared young, which with the Authority was not necessarily informative. He had the pale silver coloring that I associated with the northern court lineages, and he was looking at a display that hovered in the air beside him, showing what I assumed were my biological readings, with an expression that suggested the readings were saying something he found personally confrontational. I said, "In Authority, where am I?" He turned. He stared at me for a moment. Then he said, in carefully precise Authority, that I was in the Royal Medical Pavilion of the First Sky Court. I thought about that. I said, in the most neutral tone I could manage, that I was not supposed to be there. He said, with equal neutrality, that it was not his decision. That was when I understood that something larger than a single assassination attempt had happened, and that my position in the middle of it was not going to be easy to step out of. I tried to sit up. My left arm informed me, through a sharp and specific message, that this was ambitious. I managed a partial sit, enough to see more of the room. It was extraordinary in the way that everything Authority seemed to be, curved and precise, and lit in ways that made no architectural sense, until you stopped trying to apply architecture to it. There was a window that showed the 3 moons, lower now, which meant significant time had passed. The door to the room opened. The physician straightened immediately and moved to the side, which told me everything I needed to know about who was entering before I saw her. The Empress of the Authority Stellar Empire was 2014 years old, according to the briefing documents I had memorized. The documents had also noted that she looked middle-aged by Authority standards, which meant to human eyes she appeared to be perhaps 50, tall and still, and wearing the kind of calm that you only ever see in people who have had centuries to stop being surprised by things. Her clothing was deep blue, darker than her daughter's had been, and her eyes were the color of dark water. She came to the foot of my bed and she looked at me. I looked back at her. I was aware that there was probably some protocol I should be following. I was also aware that my left arm was still mostly useless, and I was lying in a bed in her palace without permission, so the protocol window had arguably passed. She said, in Authority that was slower and more deliberate than the physician's, as if she had decided to make allowances for my language limitations, that she had a question for me. I said she could ask it. She said, "You understood what that weapon was. You understood what it would do to you." I said I had a reasonable idea, yes. She said, "And you moved toward it." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" It was the same question I thought the princess had asked me when I was on the floor. I gave her the same answer, or what I intended to be the same answer, because my Authority was still imprecise enough that I could not be entirely sure. I said, "Because someone had to." The Empress looked at me for a very long time, long enough that the physician shifted his weight, almost imperceptibly, which in an Authority was the equivalent of someone else loudly shuffling their feet. Then she turned and left the room without another word. I looked at the physician. He looked at me. I said, "Did I say something wrong?" He said, "No." I said, "Did I say something right?" He considered this for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then he said, "Possibly," and returned to his display. I lay back against the pillows. Outside the window, the 3 moons were setting, and the sky was beginning to shift from dark ocean blue toward something that might, in a few hours, be the color of a dawn. My left arm ached with a deep, specific persistence that told me it would be functional again, eventually, which was better than the alternatives. I thought about the figure in the gray uniform. I thought about the angle of the blade. I thought about the way the princess had crouched beside me on the floor, which was something every briefing document I had read told me was deeply unusual behavior for Authority royalty. I thought about the Empress's question, and my answer, and the long silence that followed it. I had a feeling that the silence was not an ending. I had a feeling it was something much more like a beginning, and that whatever came next was going to require me to be considerably more alert than I currently was. I closed my eyes. I let the medication and the exhaustion and the distant ache do their work. I decided to be a problem for the version of me that woke up next. He would have to figure out the rest. The Authority physicians had not hidden the fact that they found me inconvenient. Not personally, I think, because Authority are too composed for something as simple as personal feelings at work. But professionally, medically, I was producing results that did not match any of their models, and this was causing them a specific kind of distress that I was beginning to enjoy, just slightly. By the third day, my left arm was responding again. Not fully, not at the range I was used to, but enough that I could hold things and complete basic tasks. The physician whose name I had learned was Severin had explained, in careful and somewhat pained authority, that the rate of my cellular recovery was not normal. He used a word I did not know, and when I asked him to define it, he used 3 other words I also did not know, and we eventually settled on the translation of alarming. I told him I healed fast. It was a human thing. He wrote something down on his display and looked at it for a while before responding. He said that he understood I was attempting to be reassuring. He said it was not working. On the 4th day, 2 things happened that changed the nature of my situation considerably. The first was that Ambassador Diane Porter came to see me. She arrived with a coalition aide named Oliver Grant, who was young and earnest, and had the expression of someone who had spent 4 days writing reports he did not fully understand. Diane sat in the chair beside my bed and looked at me with the particular combination of relief and professional concern that I had come to associate with people who were glad I was alive, but had significant questions about my life choices. She said, "Marcus, how are you?" I said I was functional. She said that the authority had refused to allow any coalition medical staff to examine me, and that the coalition's official requests for access had been answered with what she described as polite architectural responses. I said I did not know what that meant. She said it meant the authority kept explaining, at great length and with great courtesy, why my presence in the Royal Medical Pavilion was a significant honor, without ever actually answering the question about access. She said Oliver had been tracking the correspondence and had identified 17 separate responses to their requests that were technically informative and practically empty. Oliver nodded confirmation. He looked like he had not slept well. Diane said that the coalition's position was that they were glad I had acted as I had, that the diplomatic implications were significant and largely positive, and that they needed me to be available for a formal debrief as soon as my medical status allowed. She said this in the tone of someone who had a much longer list of things she needed from me and had chosen to start with the shortest one. I asked her about the assassination investigation. She said that was the second thing she needed to tell me. The figure in the gray uniform had been identified. His name, in his own language, was something that did not translate, but the authority intelligence services were calling him a contractor, which was a word that crossed language barriers efficiently. He had been hired. The weapon he had used was Velcathon in origin, a species that existed on the outer edge of Aethori-controlled space and had been in low-level conflict with the Empire for several decades. The weapon's technology was above what the Velcathon were known to produce independently, which meant someone had provided it. She said the authority were treating this as an internal investigation. She said the Coalition's intelligence office believed the attempt was designed not only to kill the princess, but to implicate humanity for the act, creating grounds for the authority to declare the new alliance void and to treat the human delegation as hostile. I sat with that for a moment. I said, so if the blade had reached her, and they had found a coalition soldier in the vicinity? Diane said, yes, exactly that. Instead, a coalition soldier took the blade himself, which rather complicated that particular narrative. I thought about the figure in gray. I thought about the positioning, the timing. The attack had been planned for this specific moment, this specific event, when a human soldier would be in the room and close enough to be accused. I said it was not an accident that I was standing where I was. Diane said she knew. She said the people who designed the attack had known a human bodyguard would be present and had planned around that. What they had not planned was that the bodyguard would move into the weapon's path rather than away from it. Oliver, very quietly, said he had read the initial Aethori Guard reports. He said none of them had anticipated that either. I told Diane I needed more information about the Velcathon connection. I told her that whoever had supplied the weapon had connections inside the Aethori court, because the attack had been too precisely timed for the information to come from outside. The contractor had known exactly where the princess would be standing, at exactly what moment, with exactly which personnel in what positions. Diane looked at me for a moment. She said that was a significant conclusion. I said it was the only conclusion the information supported. She said she would pass it to the intelligence office. She said I should focus on recovering. She said this in a tone that suggested she understood perfectly well that I was not going to do that, and that she was saying it for the record. She and Oliver left, and I sat with the implications of everything she had told me for a long time after the door closed. The second significant thing that happened on the fourth day occurred much later, after the physicians had completed their evening rounds, and Severin had added several more notes to my file, with an expression of someone cataloging the habits of a particularly puzzling natural phenomenon. I had not been sleeping well. The medication they were giving me was Athori formulated, and while it was clearly effective given the rate of my recovery, it had the side effect of keeping me in a state of shallow wakefulness that was not quite sleep and not quite alertness. I was lying in the low light of the room, somewhere between the two, when the door opened. I kept my eyes mostly closed, an old habit, from years of situations where pretending to be more asleep than you were bought you useful information. The footsteps were light, not a physician. The weight distribution was different, more deliberate, the walk of someone who had learned to move quietly as a matter of culture rather than training. The person crossed the room and stopped near the chair beside my bed, the same chair Diane had sat in that morning. There was a long silence. Then the sound of the chair shifting slightly as someone sat. More silence. No reading device. No display. No work being done. Just the quiet weight of someone sitting in a chair, in a dark room beside a person they believed was asleep. I lay still. The 3 moons were in the window again, all 3 visible this time, and their combined light was enough to see by if you did not need to see much. I did not move. I breathed steadily. I listened. Valereth, Princess of the Athori Stellar Empire, sat in that chair for 47 minutes. I know because there was a time display visible on the wall to my left, and I watched it with the peripheral vision I was careful not to make obvious. She did not speak. She did not bring anything with her. She came in. She sat. And after 47 minutes she stood up and left as quietly as she had arrived. I opened my eyes fully after the door closed. I stared at the ceiling, which was doing its slow color shift in the low light, moving through shades of deep blue, and something that was almost green. In 4 years of work, that had taken me to some of the more complicated corners of human space, I had learned to read situations. It was not always a precise skill, but it was usually reliable. I lay there in the dark, and thought about a princess who had come to sit beside a human soldier she did not know, in a room where she thought he was asleep, and stayed for 47 minutes without saying a word. I thought about what that meant. Then I thought about what I was supposed to do with what it meant, given that I was a sergeant in the Human Coalition Defense Corps, currently recovering from an alien weapon in an alien palace, involved in the edges of a political situation that my commanding officer had not prepared me for, because nobody had prepared for any of this. The answer, I decided, was that I was going to get better as fast as possible, because lying in a bed while things happened around me was not something I was built for. My left arm was improving. My mobility was returning. By Severin's most recent assessment, delivered with the tone of someone reporting a minor meteorological event that had turned out to be significantly larger than expected, my recovery was proceeding at approximately 3 times the rate he had projected. He had said approximately. I thought the number might be conservative. On the 5th day I asked Severin if I could walk. He said he had not recommended it. I said I was asking if I could, not if he recommended it. He considered this distinction for a moment. He said, physiologically, my lower body function was essentially normal. He said my left arm would continue to have reduced range for at least another few days. He said the weapon's effect on the nervous system was not fully resolved, and I might experience occasional pain events. I said I would take that risk. He said, with very precise Athori and a very Athori expression that managed to convey both professional resignation and something that was almost respect, that he would have the Walker Protocol suspended. I stood up for the first time in 5 days and took 3 steps across the room. My left arm chose that moment to deliver one of the pain events Severin had warned me about, sharp and immediate and lighting up the whole left side of my chest. I kept my face still. I kept moving. Severin watched me. He did not say anything, but he made a small note on his display, and I had the feeling it was not about the medical reading. I walked to the window. The city outside was immense, built in the Athori way that I was beginning to understand, everything curved and layered and lit from within. extending in every direction to the horizon and beyond. Somewhere out there was the main diplomatic hall where the summit was being held, or had been held, since I was unclear on the status of proceedings. Somewhere out there were the rooms where the coalition delegation was sleeping in beds that were probably slightly too large and trying to navigate situations that the training manuals had not covered. Somewhere in this palace was a queen who had asked me a question and then left without waiting for what I thought was an answer. Somewhere in this palace was a princess who sat in chairs beside people who were asleep and did not explain herself. I looked out at the city and thought about the Velcathon weapon and the contractor in gray and the perfect timing of an attack designed to start a war. I thought about the intelligence gaps that would be required to execute that kind of operation. I thought about what Diane had said, that the information had to come from inside the court. My left arm ached. I breathed through it. The thing about pain, I had learned over many years and many situations, was that it carried information. Pain told you where the problem was. Pain told you what needed attention. Pain was not pleasant, but it was honest in a way that the absence of pain was not, because the absence of pain sometimes meant the problem was somewhere you could not feel yet. I was standing in a palace I had not been invited to, recovering from a weapon I had chosen to receive, in the middle of a political situation that was getting larger and more complicated with every day. My left arm hurt, and my nervous system had opinions about its recent experience, and I was almost certainly already involved in things that my commanding officer was going to have significant concerns about. I thought, this is the most alive I have felt in 3 years. That thought surprised me enough that I almost smiled. I turned away from the window and walked back across the room. My steps were even. My back was straight. Severin watched me with the expression of someone watching a small but significant piece of evidence confirm a hypothesis. I sat on the edge of the bed. I said, I need access to the corridor. He said the corridor was outside his authority. I said, whose authority is it? He said he would make an inquiry. I said I would appreciate that. He left the room. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about inside men and Velcathon weapons, and the particular way a plan falls apart when one of its assumptions turns out to be wrong. The assumption, in this case, had been that a human soldier would react the way anyone with functioning self-preservation instincts would react when a lethal weapon moved in their direction. Whoever had planned this had not adequately accounted for the fact that some soldiers are not primarily motivated by self-preservation. Some soldiers are motivated by something older and simpler and significantly more stubborn than that. That was the gap in their intelligence. I intended to make it their problem. The corridor, once I had access to it, was extraordinary in the way that everything in the first Sky Court was extraordinary, which was to say, it looked like someone had taken the concept of a hallway and refined it over several centuries until it had nothing left in common with the hallways I had grown up in. The floor was the same dark glass material as the medical hall, and the walls curved inward slightly at the top, meeting in a line that caught and distributed the ambient light in a way that meant there were no shadows anywhere. There were no sharp corners. Everything was smooth and intentional, and slightly too perfect to feel entirely comfortable to human eyes, though I was adapting. I had been given a change of clothes. Coalition dress uniform was apparently not considered appropriate for palace movement, and Severin had arranged something that was Aethori in cut but neutral in color. A pale gray that I thought was either deliberately symbolic or purely practical, and I had chosen not to ask. I had also been given, somewhat to my surprise, a map. Not a physical one, a small device that Severin had pressed into my hand, with the air of someone completing a task he had been given, and did not fully understand. It projected a soft light that resolved into a floor plan when I held it still, showing the section of the palace I was permitted to move through, which was a more generous section than I had expected. The first thing I did was walk the perimeter of my permitted area. This was not an interesting activity from the outside, I imagine. I walked corridors. I noted doors, both the ones that were open and the ones that were not. I noted the positioning of Aethori Palace guards, their patrol patterns, their sight lines. I noted the locations of what appeared to be communication nodes embedded in the walls. I was building a picture. On my second pass through the eastern corridor, I encountered the first of the Aethori courtiers, who had decided that my presence in the palace was personally objectionable. He was tall even by Aethori standards, with the amber coloring of the southern court lineages, and an expression that managed to convey, without any particular effort or hostility, that he found my existence in this corridor to be a minor, but persistent irritation. He stopped in front of me, not blocking my path exactly, but positioned in a way that made it clear he expected me to stop. He said, in Aethori, that I appeared to be moving through the palace without an escort. I said, in Aethori, that I appeared to be. He said that this was unusual for a visitor of my status. I asked what my status was, with genuine curiosity, because this was actually something I had not been officially told. He paused. The pause was very brief, but I had spent enough time learning to read human faces that I was beginning to apply the same attention to Aethori ones, and the pause told me he had not expected the question. He said I had been designated as a guest of the medical staff. I said that was very kind of the medical staff, and continued walking. He did not stop me. I heard him make a small sound behind me that I chose to interpret as respectful uncertainty. The second Aethori courtier I encountered that morning was less elaborate in her approach. She simply looked at me with large, dark eyes as I passed a doorway she was standing near, and said, very clearly and without much expression, that I was the human who had taken the blade. I said I was. She said, in a tone that contained something I could not fully identify, that the palace staff were calling me Venkarath. I said I did not know that word. She said it was an old word. She said it referred to something that was too difficult to destroy, to be worth destroying. She said it was not always used as a compliment. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said I would take it. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not a smile, because Aethori smiles were more subtle than human ones, and easy to miss. But something. She inclined her head in what I had learned was a minimal acknowledgement, and moved on. Venkarath, the durable one, the too difficult to kill. I added it to my understanding of my current situation, which was continuing to acquire dimensions I had not originally anticipated. My real goal for the morning was not the corridors themselves. My real goal was the person I had identified, through careful attention to the movement patterns of palace staff and the indirect information contained in Severin's professional anxiety, as the coalition's unofficial point of contact within the palace structure. His name was Koran, and he was a young Aethori official whose role appeared to involve managing the flow of information between the medical staff and the rest of the court administration, and who appeared to spend a significant portion of his working day in a state of organized distress. I found him in a small room off the main corridor that served as something between an office and a waiting area. He looked up when I entered, with the expression of someone who had been expecting a message and received instead a medium-sized human soldier. I introduced myself. I said I needed information. He said he was not authorized to provide information to guests of the medical staff. I said I understood, and sat down in the available chair without being invited to, because in my experience the most efficient way to communicate that a conversation was going to happen was to make yourself comfortable. He looked at the chair I was sitting in. He looked at me. He appeared to make a decision about which of his competing concerns was most pressing. He said, "What kind of information?" I said I wanted to know about the investigation into the assassination attempt. Specifically, I wanted to know what the Aethori intelligence services had identified regarding the inside source. He said he was very certain he was not authorized to discuss that. I said I was sure that was technically true. I also said that I had information that might be relevant to the investigation, and that I would prefer to share it through appropriate channels rather than, for example, waiting until the next time the Empress came to visit me and raising it directly with her. There was a pause. He said the Empress had visited me. I said she had. He looked at his display. He looked at me again. He said, very carefully, that he might be able to arrange access to a summary of the investigation's current status, through unofficial channels, on the understanding that any information I provided in exchange would need to be properly documented and submitted through the formal inquiry process. I said that seemed completely reasonable. The information he gave me was incomplete, which I expected. Investigation summaries always are, because the people writing them are protecting their conclusions until they are certain, and the people sharing them are protecting everything else. But it was enough to confirm what I had already suspected, and add one additional piece that I had not had. The timing of the attack had been calibrated to a schedule that had not been publicly released. The princess's movement through the hall, the position she would be in at the moment of the attack, the specific window when the human delegation would be close enough to be implicated, but not close enough to intervene, unless they moved very quickly or very stupidly. All of that had required information about internal court scheduling that was restricted to a small number of people. The investigation had narrowed to a list of 19 individuals who had access to the relevant information. I looked at the list when Corin showed me. I asked him to show me the attendance records for the summit evening in question, who had been present in which part of the hall, which was a different piece of restricted information that he was increasingly willing to share now that the conversation had its own momentum. I sat with both pieces of information for several minutes. Then I said, "You can take the list down to 11. He said, "Excuse me." I said 8 of the 19 people on his list had been in positions in the hall where they could not have had communication contact with the contractor in the hour before the attack. I said the timing required contact within that window, because the contractor had made a positional adjustment about 40 minutes before the attack that corresponded with a positional adjustment the princess had made, and that adjustment had been unplanned, based on a conversation she had with Ambassador Porter, that the contractor could not have known about in advance. Corin was very quiet. I said the inside source had to have been positioned to observe the princess and transmit the update within a very short window. That eliminated everyone whose location during that period was documented and fixed. He said, very slowly, that the investigation had not looked at it that way. I said most investigations did not think about it that way, because they were looking for motive and access, rather than timing and position. I said that was a reasonable approach. I also said that motive and access gave you 19 people, and timing and position gave you 11. Corin closed his display. He said he needed to make some communications. I said I would wait. I sat in the small room while he made his communications, and I thought about the 8 people who had been removed from consideration, and the 11 who remained. And I thought about the fact that the planning for this operation had been sophisticated enough to account for almost everything, and had missed the thing that planning almost always misses, which is the human variable. Not the human soldier, the human habit. The habit of moving toward the problem instead of away from it. That habit had not only saved the princess. It had shifted every assumption in the original plan by approximately 45 degrees, and none of the consequences had landed where they were supposed to land. And now there was a coalition sergeant sitting in a palace room in an alien city, rebuilding a conspiracy's geometry from incomplete information, and the conspiracy's architects had no way to account for that either. Outside the small room, I could hear the sounds of the palace, distant music, voices in Aethori, that I was becoming more fluent in with every passing day, because language was something my brain treated as a tactical resource, and my brain was extremely motivated in tactical environments. The 3 moons were not visible from this room, but I knew they were there. My left arm delivered a moderate pain event. I noted it and continued thinking. The map Severin had given me had a section marked in a different color that I had not been able to identify from the label. I had been meaning to ask about it. Looking at it now, in the light of what Corin had just shared with me, I thought I understood what it was. It was the location of the court's senior administration offices. The list of 11 people who remained under investigation included 3 senior administration officials. I had not come to this place to investigate a conspiracy. I had come here to stand in a hall and look professional and not embarrass my species. But the conspiracy had involved itself with me in a very direct way, and I had a specific difficulty with leaving things unfinished, which my commanding officer had noted in approximately 4 separate performance reviews, and which I had never found a satisfying way to argue against, because it was completely accurate. Corin came back into the room. He looked like someone who had just had a conversation that had confirmed several things he had been hoping to have confirmed, and opened several questions he had not expected to be opening. He said the investigation team wanted to speak with me. I said I was available. He said they had some questions about my methodology. I said I imagined they did. We walked together toward the investigation offices, and I listened to the sounds of the palace around me, and thought about 11 people, and 1 contractor, and a weapon that had been pointed in one direction, and ended up in a completely different one. In my experience, conspiracies that started falling apart usually accelerated. One piece moved, and the adjacent pieces moved with it, and what had been a stable structure became something that was very fast and very loud on its way to becoming nothing at all. I intended to find out which of those 11 people was going to be the first piece to move. I was, by every official account, a guest of the medical staff. I was Venkarath, the durable one, the too difficult to destroy. I was also, and this was perhaps the part that the conspiracy's architects should have found most concerning, very interested in finishing what they had started. The Empress's announcement happened on a morning I had spent mostly in the investigation offices, which were on a level of the palace I had not previously had access to, but which Corin, now operating with the specific kind of energy that people acquire when they realize they are involved in something historically significant, had arranged for me without being asked. I was looking at a condensed version of the communication intercepts that the Authori intelligence team had gathered in the 48 hours since I had given them the 11-person shortlist, when the door opened, and an official I had not met before entered the room and said, in formal authority, that I needed a moment to parse, that my presence was requested in the main court chamber. I said I would be there shortly. He said, with the air of someone revising his expectations mid-sentence, that he had been asked to escort me there immediately. I said, all right, and stood up. The main court chamber was not the diplomatic hall where the summit had been held. It was larger. It was the room where the Empress conducted official court business, which meant it was also the room that was designed, in every architectural and social detail, to communicate the full weight of Authori civilization to anyone standing inside it. The ceiling was the actual sky, like the summit hall, but this one also had the full arc of the Authori homestar visible at this time of day, a massive presence of pale gold light that did not blind you, but did make you very aware that you were standing under a sun that was not your own. The court was assembled. I say assembled rather than gathered, because there is a distinction that the Authori take seriously. Gathered implies people who happen to be in a place. Assembled implies people who were placed there according to a structure, each person in a specific position that communicated specific relationships. I did not know all of those relationships, but I had learned enough in the previous days to read the general shape of the room, and the shape told me that this was serious and formal and significant. Ambassador Diane Porter was there. She was standing with the coalition delegation near the left side of the room, and she gave me a look when I entered that contained a great deal of information in a very small expression. The information was primarily, I do not fully know what is happening, but I believe it is large. Oliver Grant was beside her. He was holding a document device, and appeared to have been taking notes. He looked like someone who had been taking notes for several days without adequate sleep, and was beginning to consider the notes as personal companions. The Empress was on the raised area at the far end of the room, which I had learned was called the Clarity Platform, a name that communicated the Authori belief that truth and authority existed at the same elevation. She was wearing deep blue again, and her expression was exactly what it always was, composed and attentive, and containing more thought than was visible. Princess Valereth was to her right. She was looking at a point on the middle distance, which in Authori public settings was the appropriate place to direct one's gaze when waiting for formal proceedings to begin. I was placed, by the official who had escorted me, in a position that I had not expected, not with the coalition delegation, not at the back of the room. In the center, equidistant from the walls, which in this particular room's layout meant I was standing on the central axis, the line that ran from the main doors directly to the Clarity Platform. In Authori court architecture, the central axis was not where you put people who were unimportant. I kept my back straight, and my expression neutral, and waited. The Empress spoke. She spoke in formal High Authori, which was a register I was not fully fluent in, but she also spoke slowly and with deliberate precision, and I caught enough of it to understand the substance. There were phrases I missed, nuances in the formal register that I had not yet learned, but the structure of the announcement was clear enough. She spoke about the events of the summit, about the attack, about the investigation, about the nature of debt in Authori culture, which was not a financial concept but a relational one, the understanding that certain actions created bonds that the culture was obligated to recognize. Then she used a phrase I did know, because I had encountered it in the briefing documents and found it interesting without expecting it to ever be relevant to my specific situation. Velshara, Royal Guardian bonded. I stood very still. She continued speaking. I caught the outline of it, the formal acknowledgement, the legal weight of the title in Authori history, the obligations it created, the recognition it represented. I caught the phrase that meant, human of the coalition. I caught my name, rendered in Aethori phonetics that were close enough to recognizable. I heard, somewhere to my left, what might have been Oliver Grant making a small sound and then stopping himself. Diane Porter's expression did not change, but her stillness became of a different quality, the stillness of someone who is processing something quickly and does not want the processing to be visible. When the Empress finished speaking, the court chamber was quiet for a moment. Then sound moved through it, in a way that was very controlled and very Aethori, not the kind of noise that a human crowd makes when surprised, but a modulation of presence, a shift in the room's collective weight. I stood on the central axis and thought about what had just happened. Velshera was not, in its original understanding, simply an honorific. I knew that from the briefing documents. The briefing documents had described it as a historical title, rarely used, significant in ancient Aethori tradition. What the briefing documents had been less clear on was the full scope of what it meant, which I suspected was because the Coalition's researchers had treated it as a symbolic gesture rather than a structural one. After the ceremony, in the smaller reception room, where the Empress met with the senior figures of the court privately, I had approximately 4 minutes with Corin before the formal meetings began, and I used them to ask him, very directly, what the full legal implications of the title were. He told me. I stood in the reception room for a moment after he finished. Then I said, "So I am now formally recognized in Aethori law as a member of the extended royal household." He said, "Essentially, yes." I said this without my knowledge or consent. He said, with very careful Aethori, that consent was not a structural requirement of the Velshara designation, as historically the designation was conferred as a recognition of acts already completed, and that consent was perhaps the human framework, while the Aethori framework was one of acknowledgement. I thought about that. I said, the Empress made a political decision and framed it as a cultural obligation. He paused. He said, that was a way to describe it. I said, it was a way to describe it that was accurate. He said, I am not going to confirm or deny that in this setting. I thought about the Empress in the medical room, sitting in the chair, asking me why, and leaving without waiting for what she appeared to already know the answer to. I thought about the long silence after I said, because someone had to. I thought about a 2,000-year-old person who had been navigating the most complex political structure in this region of the galaxy for most of recorded history. She had seen something in me. Not necessarily something positive, not necessarily something she liked, something useful. Something she had decided needed to be anchored to the Aethori court in a way that was legally unambiguous and politically unchallengeable. I was, with a reasonable degree of certainty, the first human in history to become a member of an alien royal household. The Coalition was going to have questions. I was standing near the reception room window when Ambassador Diane Porter found me, which did not take her long because she is a very efficient person. She came to stand beside me and looked out at the same view I was looking at, which was the palace's eastern garden, a space of carefully arranged living structures that moved slowly in response to the light. She said, Marcus. I said, Diane. She said, the Coalition diplomatic team has been reviewing the ceremony transcript for the past 20 minutes. I said I imagined they had. She said Oliver had compiled a 17-point briefing document on the implications of the Velshera designation in Aethori law and custom, based on what sources he could access quickly, and that the document was currently being transmitted to the Coalition Council. I said that sounded like Oliver. She said, very calmly, that the title appeared to create a permanent formal bond between me and the Aethori royal line that superseded my existing military chain of command in certain specific contexts. I said I had received a similar summary. She said, and you are not surprised. I thought about that. I said I was not entirely surprised, no. She looked at me for a moment. She said, you understand this is unprecedented. I said I understood. She said, you also understand that the Coalition Council is going to want a great deal of explanation. I said I did. I said that before I provided any explanation to the Coalition Council, I had one remaining piece of work to complete, and that it was related to the investigation, and that I expected to have it concluded within the next day. Diane was quiet for a moment. She said, the 11 people. I said, the 11 people. She said, you have a conclusion. I said, "I had a strong indication. I said I was going to confirm it this afternoon." She looked at me for another moment, then she said, "You know what you are, Marcus." I said I did not entirely, at the moment. She said, "You are the most inconvenient person I have ever been grateful for." She left to manage the coalition diplomatic response to the morning's events, which I suspected was going to involve a number of communications that would require very precise language. I turned back to the window. In the garden below, something moved that I did not at first recognize as living. A structure of woven branches that slowly rearranged its orientation toward the light. It was patient in a way that made biological time visible. Not fast enough to watch in real time, but clearly different from where it had been an hour ago. I had been in this palace for 11 days. I had arrived as a ceremonial bodyguard for a diplomatic delegation, and I was now, according to Aethori law, something else entirely. My left arm was almost fully functional. My Aethori was noticeably better than it had been a week ago. I had narrowed an assassination investigation from 19 suspects to 11, and I believed I knew which of those 11 was responsible. Everything about my situation was irregular and complicated, and had absolutely no precedent in the Coalition's operational manuals. I found that I was not unhappy about this. In the afternoon, I went back to the investigation offices and confirmed what I had suspected, using the updated communication records that had arrived that morning and a conversation with the Aethori defector, a lean, quiet person named Vass who had once worked for the Velcathon Syndicate as a logistics coordinator and who had been living inside the Aethori intelligence services as an asset for the past 3 years. Vass was the unlikely ally I had not expected to find, and he had information about the Syndicate's internal communication protocols that, combined with the court scheduling data, made one of the 11 names very clear. The name was Lord Esaveth, Senior Court Administrator, 37 years in the palace service, impeccable record, known for his opposition to the new alliance with humanity, which he had argued against in formal court proceedings on 3 separate occasions, always with perfect courtesy and technically unimpeachable reasoning. I sat with Vass in the data for 2 hours and built a case. It was not the kind of case that would satisfy a coalition court. It was the kind of case that would satisfy an Aethori court, which operated on different evidentiary standards but which was, in its own way, thorough. The Aethori were not a people who made accusations lightly. They were also not a people who, once sufficient information was assembled, delayed in acting on it. The following morning, I requested an audience with the Empress. I did not expect to receive one quickly. She was the ruler of an interstellar empire, and while I now had a title that apparently created certain formal relationships with the royal house, I was under no illusion that the 2,000-year-old woman was waiting for my schedule to open up. She saw me within the hour. We met in the same room where she had asked me why I had moved into the Blade's path. It was smaller than I would have expected for an audience room, but I was beginning to understand that the Empress preferred small rooms for conversations that mattered. I presented the case. I did not use elaborate language or formal Aethori rhetorical structures, because I had not been trained in those, and attempting them would have made me look less competent rather than more. I used what I had, which was direct, organized logic, and clear evidence presented in the order that demonstrated the conclusion most efficiently. She listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both demonstrating that she had understood everything I had said, and was verifying specific points, rather than seeking general clarification. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have built this case in 11 days. I said I had had help." She said, "The investigation team had the same information." I said they had been looking at it from a different angle. She said, "The human angle." I said, "I suppose so." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Velshara, you are aware of what will happen now." I said I was. She said, "And you are comfortable with that?" I thought about Lord Esaveth's record of perfect courtesy and technical precision in opposing the alliance. I thought about a contractor in a gray uniform and a blade made of Velcathon technology. I thought about what would have happened to the alliance, to humanity's position in this part of the galaxy, to the princess of the Aethori court, if I had not moved. I said I was very comfortable with that. The Empress did not smile. She was not a person who smiled easily. or perhaps simply a person for whom smiling was a different thing than it was for me. But there was something in her expression that was not quite what it had been when I came into the room. She said, "You will be present in court tomorrow morning." I said I would. She said, "Velshara, I am going to tell you something that I do not tell many people." I waited. She said, "When I came to see you in the medical room, I expected to see a person who had made a calculation, a political gesture, a way to position humanity favorably in a difficult moment. I expected to see, in your face, the awareness of what you had done and what it might mean." She said, "I did not see that." She said, "I saw someone who had moved toward a problem because the problem was there and he was the closest person who could address it." She said, "I have been ruling this empire for almost half a millennium. In that time, I have met many capable people, many intelligent people, many people who were brave in the way that brave is performed. I have met very few people who were simply, quietly, actually what they appeared to be." She said, "That is what I saw in you." She said, "And that is why we are having this conversation." She left the room. I stood in the small room for a moment after she was gone. Then I walked out into the corridor and went to find Corin, because there was more work to do before tomorrow morning, and I had learned that things left unfinished in the authority court had a way of becoming more complicated with time. My left arm was nearly back to full function. My authority was improving every day. I had a title I had not asked for, and a case that was about to be presented in formal court, and a commanding officer who had sent me 7 messages in the past week that I had been meaning to answer. I thought I would answer them after tomorrow. Tomorrow felt important. It was. I want to be clear about what happened in that court chamber, because there are several versions of it now, and most of them have added things that were not there, and removed things that were. What happened was this. I stood in the center of the main court chamber, in the same position I had stood in 2 days earlier during the Velshara ceremony, and I presented a case. I did not perform it. I did not dramatize it. I stated what I knew, in the order that demonstrated why I knew it, and I stopped when I had finished. The court was assembled in the formal configuration, which I had learned by then to read with reasonable accuracy. The Empress was on the clarity platform. The Princess was at her right. The senior court officials were arranged according to the specific geometric logic of a Thori hierarchy, which placed those with more authority in positions that were subtly but precisely distinct from those with less. Lord Esaveth was present. He was in his designated position, because to be absent from a formal court assembly without documented reason was, in a Thori culture, a kind of confession in itself. He was very still, and very composed, and he had the expression of a person who has rehearsed being calm, so thoroughly that it had become structural. I spoke in Aethori. I had rehearsed my phrasing with Corin the night before, not because I needed help building the logic, but because the formal presentation of a case in Aethori court required specific structural elements that I did not want to inadvertently omit, and thereby give anyone a technical reason to dismiss the substance. I described the attack. I described the information requirements that had made the attack possible. I described the process by which I had identified the constraints on the inside source, the timing window, the positional requirements, the communication protocols the syndicate used. I described the way those constraints, applied to the list of individuals with appropriate access, produced a single name. I said the name. The chamber was very quiet. Lord Esaveth said, in formal Aethori that was perfectly modulated, that the accusation was extraordinary, and that he welcomed the opportunity to address each of its elements individually. I said I had anticipated that, and had prepared for it. What followed was not a fight. It was not dramatic in the way that human court scenes in stories tend to be dramatic. It was methodical and careful, and it moved at Aethori pace, which is slower and more precise than human pace, and it took the better part of 3 hours. But it was also, in its own way, a kind of fight. Lord Esaveth was extremely intelligent and had been managing Aethori court politics for nearly 4 decades. He knew exactly how to engage with formal court proceedings. He knew which questions to ask and which to avoid. He knew how to create the appearance of engaging with evidence, while actually redirecting attention to procedural questions. I had known this would be the case. I had planned for it, in the way that I plan for things, which is to start from the conclusion I am confident in, and work backward to find every possible path someone might take away from that conclusion, and then close the paths. For each redirection Lord Esiveth attempted, I had a specific, documented response, not a counter-argument, because counter-arguments in Aethori formal proceedings can be treated as challenges to authority rather than statements of fact. Responses. Evidence that occupied the space he was trying to move into. By the second hour, he had stopped redirecting. He was answering direct questions instead, and the answers were becoming shorter. By the third hour, the Empress spoke for the first time since I had begun. She asked Lord Esiveth one question, a single question in formal high Aethori, that I caught only partially but understood the structure of, because it was the kind of question that contained its answer in its formation, the kind that you only ask when the evidence already indicates the answer, and you are giving someone the chance to provide it themselves before the court provides it for them. Lord Esiveth was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something in Aethori that I was going to need Corin to translate fully later, but which had the shape of an acknowledgement. The chamber went very still. The Empress issued orders in 4 sentences that Corin would later explain to me in detail. The summary of those 4 sentences was, the investigation team would take formal custody, the designated officials would review all relevant materials, the outcomes of that review would be addressed according to Aethori law, and the court was adjourned. 4 sentences, 3 hours of work, and then 4 sentences. I was not prepared for what happened next, because it was not in any briefing document I had read. The Empress, still on the clarity platform, looked at me directly and said, in the slower, more deliberate Aethori she used when she was speaking to me specifically, Ven Karath, you have served this court. The formal Aethori word for served in that context was not the word for a servant, it was the word used for what an ally does. I said, in Aethori, it was the right thing to do. She said, yes. Then the court chamber was in motion, the controlled and organized motion of an Aethori formal assembly coming to a close, and I was standing in the center of the room, and the sound was moving around me, and I felt, for the first time in 11 days, that the situation I had been managing was reaching something like resolution. Oliver found me near the doors. He was carrying 3 document devices, and had the expression of someone who had been living inside a historical event for 2 weeks, and was only just beginning to understand the scope of it. He said, that was remarkable. I said I was glad it worked. He said, the Coalition Council is going to want a full briefing. I said I knew. He said, and the Velshara designation is going to require significant diplomatic discussion. I said I was aware. He said, and they are also going to want to know whether you are coming back. I had not thought about that specific question in those specific terms. It arrived with more weight than I had anticipated. I said, I do not know yet. He looked at me for a moment. He had the good sense not to push the question further. He went back to his notes. The evening, after the formal events of the day were concluded, I found myself on a balcony I had discovered 3 days earlier, a narrow, curved space on the eastern side of the palace that was not used for anything official and had a view of the city that stretched to the horizon. The 3 moons were all visible, which happened on certain nights when their orbital positions aligned. They were very large and very clear, and the light they made together was a kind of soft pale silver that did not exist anywhere on Earth. I heard footsteps behind me. Valereth came to stand beside me at the railing. She looked out at the city and the moons and did not say anything for a while. I did not say anything either. The silence was not awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who had been in proximity to a significant amount of danger and were not required, at this precise moment, to do anything about it. Eventually she said, in Aethori that was a slightly less formal register than I usually heard from her, that what I had done in court today was not what she had expected. I said, what did you expect? She said, I expected force. Humans, in my understanding, resolve conflicts through the application of force. I said, sometimes. She said, you resolved this one through evidence and logic, presented inside the rules of our court, in our language, on our schedule. I said I worked with what was available. She turned to look at me then, in the moonlight, with the city spread out behind her. She said, you fight like someone who has nothing to lose. I thought about that. I thought about the blade in the hall, and the 11 days since, and the Empress's question, and my answer. I thought about what I had in this palace now, and what I might have when I left it, and what leaving it would actually mean. I said, I fight like someone who has everything to protect. She looked at me for a long time after that. Neither of us spoke. The 3 moons were very bright. My commanding officer's message arrived 4 hours later, after she had gone, and I was back in my quarters looking at the current status reports from the coalition delegation. The message from Colonel Lawrence Webb was very long and very carefully worded, and contained 17 questions, 4 warnings, 2 requests for clarification on specific points of Aethori law regarding the Velshara title, and 1 line at the very bottom of the document that said, simply, and without any of the surrounding formality, "Hail, what did you do?" I sat with the message for a while. Then I started writing my response. I was going to need more words than I usually used. There is a specific kind of silence that falls when you are in a place you did not plan to be, doing things you did not plan to do, and you realize that the planning is no longer the point. I had been in the Aethori court for 6 weeks. My left arm was fully functional. My Aethori had crossed from competent to fluent, in a way that still surprised me when I stopped to notice it. I had a title in Aethori law that the Coalition's legal office had spent the past 2 weeks analyzing, and had ultimately classified as, I quote from their official report, unprecedented, but potentially stabilizing from a diplomatic perspective, which was their way of saying they did not know what to do with it, but they were not ready to say it was a problem. Colonel Webb had stopped sending me messages with 17 questions. He had started sending messages that were shorter and more direct, which in my experience meant he had made a decision about something and was in the process of communicating its parameters. The decision arrived on a Thursday. Aethori weeks were structured differently from human ones, but I had maintained my Earth calendar out of habit, and possibly out of a need to keep some part of my orientation intact. It was a formal request, submitted by Diane Porter on behalf of the Coalition Diplomatic Office, to the Aethori Stellar Court, requesting that Sergeant Marcus Hale be designated as the Coalition's permanent human liaison to the Aethori Royal Court. The Aethori Court accepted the request within 6 hours, which in Aethori bureaucratic terms was essentially instantaneous. The acceptance was accompanied by a formal statement from the court administration that the assignment was consistent with the Velshara designation and was welcomed. I read the document 3 times. The Empress had known this was coming. She had, with considerable patience and precision, arranged exactly this outcome over the course of 6 weeks, and I had been present for the entire arrangement and had not fully seen it until the document was in front of me, with both signatures on it. I went to find her. She was in the smaller reception room, reading from a display that she set aside when I entered, without showing any surprise at my presence. I said, "You arranged this." She said, "The Coalition submitted the request." I said, "You knew they would submit it." She said, "I knew the diplomatic value was clear, and that the Coalition would identify that value, yes." I said, "And the Aethori Court's immediate acceptance." She said, "It was consistent with existing designations." I said, "Empress." She looked at me with the expression she used when she was allowing someone to say the thing they actually meant. I said, "You decided I was staying. You arranged for it to be framed as a coalition initiative." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I decided this court needed something it had never had before. A person in it who operates without performance. Every person in this court, from the newest attendant to my most senior official, operates within a framework of presentation. They are never entirely what they appear. This is not a criticism. It is simply the nature of a structure built over thousands of years of complex political life. Every person in it is performing, constantly, the version of themselves that best serves the structure." She said, "You do not do that." She said, "When I asked you why you moved toward the blade, you said because someone had to. Not because of duty, not because of alliance relations, not because of political calculation, because someone had to." She said, "I have never in 2,000 years encountered that answer. I needed to understand it better. I decided the best way to understand it was to keep it close." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "And Valereth." The Empress looked at me for a long time. She said, "My daughter has been performing her role for her entire life." She is exceptional at it. She has never, to my knowledge, sat beside a sleeping person for 47 minutes, out of something she could not explain in court language. I felt something in my chest that was not a pain event from the old wound. I said, "You knew about that?" She said, "I know most things that happen in this palace." I said, "And you are comfortable with it?" She said, "I am comfortable with things that are real." Comfortable is perhaps not the correct word. I recognize things that are real. I assign them appropriate value. She said, "Velshara, you are staying." It was not a question. I said, "I know." She picked up her display again. I stood there for another moment. I said, "Empress." She said, "Yes." I said, "When I said because someone had to, I meant it." She said, "I know." I said, "I still mean it. About all of it." She looked at me over the display. She said, "Yes. I know that too. That is precisely the point." I left the room. In the corridor, I stood still for a moment and let the weight of what had just been said settle. 6 weeks ago I had been a soldier, assigned to stand at the back of a room and not embarrass my species. I was now a permanent fixture in the most politically complex court in this region of the galaxy, with a title in alien law, with a commanding officer who had stopped asking questions and started sending shorter messages, with fluency in a language I had not spoken 2 months ago. And with, if I was being honest with myself, which I tried to be, on the grounds that the alternative was less useful, something that I had not expected when I arrived here, something I had not been looking for, something that sat beside people in dark rooms for 47 minutes without explanation. I sent my mother a message that evening. I had not sent her one since arriving at the court, which was bad of me, and something she would mention at some length the next time we spoke. I kept the message short. I told her I was well. I told her I was not coming home for a while. I told her I was somewhere extraordinary, and that I was needed here, and that things had developed in ways I had not anticipated. She sent back 3 words. "Is she pretty?" I stared at the message for approximately 30 seconds. Then I put the communication device away and went to find Valereth, because we were supposed to go over the next week's diplomatic schedule together, which was an entirely professional and logistically necessary meeting that I was looking forward to with an enthusiasm that had nothing to do with diplomatic schedules. The 3 moons were rising. My left arm did not hurt at all. When the report came in from the outer tracking stations, it was 2 in the morning by my personal clock, and I was in the middle of a meeting with the Authority Intelligence Coordination Team that had been running for 3 hours and showed no signs of ending. I want to say I knew immediately what it meant. I did not. The first transmission that came through was fragmented, the kind of broken signal that you get when someone is transmitting under interference, and my first thought was a technical problem with one of the relay stations in the outer system. The second transmission was not fragmented. The message was brief. It was in a coalition communication format that I had not heard in 18 months, the kind of format used by field operatives in active situations, short and precise, and stripping everything unnecessary from the content. It said that Valereth, Princess of the Authori Stellar Court, had not returned from the survey visit to the outer observatory station. The shuttle was not responding. 3 escort vessels had reached the station's last known position and found the escort fighters with communications disabled. She was gone. The room around me continued for a moment after I read it, the meeting continuing, voices in Authori discussing resource allocation and communication protocols. I stood up. Everyone stopped talking. I said, "In Authori, I need to speak with the Empress. Now." The senior intelligence coordinator, a composed person named Aleth who I had worked alongside for 5 weeks, and who had never once appeared hurried, looked at me, looked at the communication device in my hand, and said, "What has happened?" I told them. The next 4 hours were organized chaos, which is the best kind of chaos, the kind where everyone is moving fast but with direction. The Authori Court mobilized in the way that large, sophisticated organizations mobilize, through layers of protocol and communication and official processes, each layer triggering the next. I watched it happen. I watched the Empress issue commands in the controlled, steady way that I had come to understand as her genuine response to crisis, not the performance of calm but the actual thing, built from 2,000 years of understanding, that visible panic in a leader accelerates the deterioration of every system around them. I watched Diane Porter arrive with Oliver Grant and the Coalition diplomatic team, all of them pulled from sleep, all of them processing the situation. I watched the official channels open. I watched the formal communications go out. I watched the authority judicial process begin the preliminary steps toward designating this a hostage situation, which would then trigger a specific sequence of diplomatic and military responses. All of this was correct. All of this was what should happen. I went to the Empress. She was in the command coordination room, a space I had only been in twice before, surrounded by her senior officials and her military advisors. She looked at me when I entered, and I looked at her. I said, "I am going." She said, "The military response teams are being assembled." I said, "I know. I am still going." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "The Velshara designation does not extend to active military operations." I said, "I know." She said, "What you are proposing falls outside your coalition assignment parameters." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Velshara." I said, "Empress, I will bring her back." She was quiet for a long moment. Around us, the room continued its organized activity, information moving, and decisions being made. She said, "You have 3 hours before the official military response elements are in position to begin coordinated action." I said, "That is enough." She said, "You will have access to 2 escort vessels and Vass, if he is willing." I said, "I will ask him." She said, "You will also have the authority communication frequency codes for the outer system, which are not normally available to coalition personnel." I said I understood the significance of that. She looked at me with the expression she wore when she had finished making a decision, and was watching it become real. She said, "I have been watching you for 6 weeks. You are exactly what you appear to be. That is either the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, or the most necessary." She said, "I believe I have concluded which." She turned back to the coordination table. I left the room at a pace that a Thori court decorum would consider aggressive, and that I considered, under the circumstances, completely appropriate. Vass was awake. He was, I suspected, almost always awake. He was the kind of person who treated sleep as a technical requirement, rather than a preference, allocating the minimum necessary, and spending the rest of his time in a state of active readiness. He listened to what I told him in approximately 90 seconds and then said, in his precise, minimal way, that he was available. We were on the escort vessels within 40 minutes. I had done operations like this before, in the sense that I had moved fast through spaces I did not fully know, toward objectives that were only partially defined. What I had not done before was do it in a region of space that was not human-controlled, with technology I was still learning, in coordination with an alien intelligence asset, and with the full awareness that every minute of delay corresponded directly to the safety of a specific person. I tried not to think about the specific person in terms that were personal. It was not entirely successful. The Velcathon Syndicate, in the aftermath of Lord Esaveth's arrest, had not dissolved entirely. Organizations built on specific interests do not dissolve simply because one of their facilitators is removed. They restructure. They find new leverage. They identify new operations. Their new operation, I understood as I looked at the trajectory data Vass had pulled, was not primarily about the assassination they had failed to complete. It was about creating a hostage crisis that forced the Authori court into a position of negotiating under pressure, which was something the Authori were not built for, and which would demonstrate, publicly and undeniably, that the court could be pressured. It was, in its logic, a sound strategy. It was designed to work regardless of whether the hostage was recovered, because the fact of the crisis itself was the message. It was also a strategy, built on the assumption that the response to the crisis would be organized and official, and follow predictable channels. I was not an organized official response. Vass and I found the holding location through a combination of the communication frequency codes the Empress had provided, and a piece of syndicate communication logic that Vass understood from his years inside their structure, and that he explained to me in the time we spent traveling. The codes allowed us to detect the faint residue of encrypted traffic in a frequency band the syndicate used for internal operations. The traffic was not enough to decode, but it was enough to locate. The location was a secondary installation, small and built into an asteroid structure in the outer belt. Not designed as a long-term facility, designed as a waypoint, which meant it was lightly staffed and primarily functional, rather than defensively configured. Vass looked at the structural scans and said, 12, possibly 15 personnel. I looked at the scans. I said, I make it 10. He said, why? I said, the power distribution is wrong for 15. 15 people in a facility this size generate a specific thermal and electrical footprint. This is closer to 10. He looked at the scans again. He said, 10. I said, I will go in. You maintain the communication link and the extraction path. He said, you understand I am not primarily a field operative. I said, I know. You are a logistics coordinator. You are very good at logistics. I need the extraction route to be perfect. He considered this. He said, it will be. What happened in the next 4 hours I will not describe in complete detail. Not because it is something I am unwilling to speak about, but because the specific mechanics of it are less important than the outcome, and the people who want the specific mechanics for their own purposes can find them in the Coalition operational debrief that was filed 3 weeks later and has a significant number of sections classified. What I will say is this. I moved through that facility in the way I have moved through difficult places for 14 years, which is forward and quiet and with complete attention to what is actually present, rather than what the map suggests should be present. I encountered 10 people, as I had calculated, and I dealt with them in ways that were effective and will not require further elaboration. I found Valereth in a secured room in the interior of the facility, which was unpleasant and functional, and had been her location for approximately 8 hours. She was unharmed, or close enough to unharmed that the difference would be addressed by medical staff rather than by anything requiring immediate concern. She looked at me when the door opened. Her expression went through several things in quick succession, the first of which was the automatic Aethori composure that she maintained in all circumstances, the second of which was something that was very much not composure. I said, we need to move. She said, in Aethori, that was very steady considering everything. I see that. She stood up. She moved with the balance and control of someone who had been physically uncomfortable for hours, and was choosing not to acknowledge it. I walked ahead of her, and she followed, and we moved through the facility and out through the path I had established, and into the escort vessel, and Vass, who was indeed very good at logistics, had the extraction route ready and clear. We were away from the facility, and in open space, within 11 minutes of the door opening. Valereth sat in the co-pilot position and said nothing for a while. I did not push it. We were moving at speed back toward Aethori space, and there was nothing immediate left to manage. Eventually she said, how did you find me? I said, communications trace and thermal mapping. She said, how did you get there before the military response? I said, I left before the military response. She said, that is not how official response protocols work. I said, no, it is not. There was a pause. She said, you came without authorization. I said, the Empress gave me a 3-hour window. She said, the Empress authorized a 2-person extraction operation rather than a coordinated military response. I said, essentially. She said, Marcus. This was, to my knowledge, the first time she had used my given name. I said, yes. She said, you are the most irregularly structured person I have ever encountered. I said, that is a fair observation. She said, in Aethori formal language, there is a concept that refers to a person who occupies a position outside all existing categories, who cannot be placed in any established structure because they predate the structures, or exceed them, or simply do not fit within them. The word for such a person is very old and is not used as a complement in contemporary court language, but its original meaning is not negative. She said, I have been trying to identify the correct Aethori concept for what you are, for approximately 6 weeks. I said, and? She said, I think it might be that one. I looked at the navigation display for a moment. Then I looked at her. She was looking back at me with the direct, clear look that I had first seen on the floor of the diplomatic hall, the look that was the first genuine thing I had seen from her. I said, are you all right? She said, I am now. It was a very direct and very uncharacteristic thing for an Aethori royal to say in those words, and we both knew it, and neither of us commented on it. Vass, from the station behind us, said that he had confirmed contact with the Authori military response elements and that they were adjusting to receive us, rather than continue to the original destination. I said, "Good work." He said, "The power distribution estimate was 9, not 10. I said, "I will accept the correction." He said nothing further, which was his way of indicating that the correction was the entirety of what he wanted to say. We came into Authori space an hour and 40 minutes later, and the military response ships that had assembled fell into escort formation around us, which was the most organized welcoming committee I had ever received, and we made our approach to the first sky court, under 3 moons and a sky the color of dark water. I thought about the facility in the asteroid, and the 10 people, and the 8 hours, and the room with the functional door, and Vaylireth standing up in it, and choosing to say nothing about the previous 8 hours, because there was work to do. I thought about what she had said in the shuttle, and what she had not said, and what the not saying contained. I thought about the Empress, and the 3-hour window, and the communication frequency codes for the outer system, which were not normally available to Coalition personnel. When we docked and the bay doors sealed, and the system's confirmed atmosphere and pressure and everything went from the precise coordination of active operation to the slightly looser feeling of completion, I sat for a moment in the pilot's seat. Vaylireth was looking at me again. She said, "You fight like someone who has nothing to lose." I said, "I fight like someone who has everything to protect." The silence after that was of a different quality than any silence we had shared before. She said, very quietly, that she had spent 8 hours in that room, calculating probabilities. She said she was very good at calculating probabilities. She said the probabilities had not been favorable. I said I knew. She said, "I calculated a probability for you." I said, "And?" She said, "It was also not favorable, according to standard parameters." I said, "I do not tend to operate within standard parameters." She said, "I had noticed." She said, "The standard parameters do not account for whatever it is that you are." She said, "Marcus, I think that you are the most terrifying thing I have ever loved." It was, without question, the most direct sentence I had ever heard from an Authori royal, and it landed with the weight of something that had been building for 6 weeks across 2 continents of very careful not saying. I said, "That might be the best thing anyone has ever said to me." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she did something I had never seen her do in public, and had only glimpsed once in private, in the small hours in the medical room. She laughed. Not a court sound, not a formal expression, a real one, full and genuine, the sound of someone who had spent 8 hours in a very dark room, and was now in a lit one, with all the relief that the contrast carried. I decided, in that moment, that I would do exactly what I had done in the facility in the asteroid, and what I had done in the diplomatic hall 6 weeks ago, which was keep this thing safe, whatever it took, for as long as it took. The 3 moons were outside the bay window. Vass, from the back of the shuttle, said that the medical team was waiting on the dock. We went to meet them. My mother responded to my message within 3 hours, which for her was fast, which meant she had been watching her communication device for updates, in a way that she would deny if I asked. Her message said, "I knew it. Tell me everything." I sent back, "Not yet." She sent back, "Soon." I sent back, "Yes." The formal ceremony was scheduled for 12 days after the recovery operation, which gave me time to do several things that needed doing. I debriefed with the Coalition Intelligence Office, which took 2 days and involved significantly more paperwork than any operation I had previously conducted, largely because none of the standard forms adequately captured what had actually happened, and I had to write substantial addenda to most of them. I debriefed with the Authori Intelligence Coordination Team, which was less formal but took longer, because Aleth asked better questions and was not working from forms. I spent 3 evenings with Vass going through what remained of the Syndicate's outer communications network, identifying the elements that were still active, and passing the relevant information to both the Coalition and Authori intelligence teams. Vass was thorough and specific, and had an excellent memory, and expressed no curiosity about anything that was not directly relevant to the work, which made him exceptionally useful. I spent time with Vaylireth, not in any formal sense, just time, on the balcony where we had stood the night of the court ceremony. in the gardens, which she knew far better than I did, and which she walked through in the morning when the light was particular and the living structures were at their most visibly active. In the investigation offices, once, going through the final documentation of the Esaveth case, because she had asked to see the completed record, and I had thought she had the right to see it. She did not, in those 12 days, reference what she had said in the shuttle. I did not either. Some things exist better in the space of their own weight, rather than in the compression of discussion, and we had both, I thought, understood that. On the 9th day, I received a communication from Colonel Lawrence Webb that was different from all the previous ones. It was short. It said that the Coalition Council had reviewed the permanent liaison assignment and the Velshara designation in full, and that the Council had authorized the assignment with a formal endorsement, which meant my position at the Authority Court was official in every sense that the Coalition recognized. It said that he, Webb, was glad I was not dead. It said that I had done something extraordinary, and that he was not particularly surprised, which he meant as a compliment, even if it did not quite sound like one. It said that if I needed anything, I should ask. I sent back, "Thank you, sir." He sent back, "Don't do anything else extraordinary for at least a month. I need the forms to catch up." The ceremony on the 12th day was in the main court chamber, in the formal assembly configuration. I had been in that room twice before under significant circumstances, and this time was different from both of them, though I could not have said precisely how until I was standing in it. The court was assembled. The Empress was on the Clarity platform. Valereth was at her right. The entire senior membership of the Authority Court was present, along with the full Coalition diplomatic delegation, and, via communication relay, representatives of 3 allied species who had received invitations and responded with formal acceptances. I stood in the center of the room and thought about a night 6 months ago when I had been told to stand at the back of a different room and look professional. The Empress spoke. She spoke about the history of the Velshara designation and its original meaning, which Corin had spent several days helping me understand fully, because the briefing documents had been incomplete. The original meaning was what she had told me in the small room: a recognition of acts completed, a formal acknowledgement of debt that could not be paid in ordinary terms and so was paid in structure, in belonging, in law. She spoke about what the designation meant in its ancient form, which went further than the briefing documents had indicated. She said, in formal authority that she then translated, phrase by phrase, into the common diplomatic language, so that the entire assembly could follow, that the Velshara designation, in its ancient and original form, was not merely a title of honor. It was an adoption into the structure of the royal house, not by blood, not by marriage, by merit and sacrifice, which in ancient authority law were the highest possible grounds. She said that, according to that ancient law, Marcus Hale of the Human Coalition was formally recognized as a member of the extended royal family of the Authority Stellar Court. The chamber was very quiet for 3 seconds. I had known this was coming. Corin had told me. The Empress had confirmed it 2 days ago, in the small room where she confirmed things. I had had 12 days to consider it, and I had considered it from every angle I could think of. And yet, standing in the chamber, hearing it said formally and publicly, and in the presence of every significant political figure in this part of the galaxy, I felt the weight of it in a way that prior knowledge had not fully prepared me for. Diane Porter was in the chamber. I looked at her. She looked back at me with an expression that I had never seen from her before, which was the expression of someone who has been present at something historically significant, and knows it, and does not quite have the category for the feeling that accompanies that knowledge. Oliver Grant was beside her. He had stopped taking notes. He was just standing there, which for Oliver was its own kind of indication. The Empress said, "Velshara Marcus Hale, you are permitted to speak." I had prepared something. I want to be honest about that. I am a person who prepares. I had written notes. I had thought about formal authority rhetorical structures. I had considered the appropriate register. I looked at the notes once, in the morning, and then I put them away, because when I tried to say them aloud, they did not sound like anything I would actually say, and I had learned from the Empress herself that being exactly what you appeared to be was, in this space, the most valuable thing I could offer. I said, in authority, that I had come to this palace 6 weeks ago as a soldier doing a job. I said I had stepped between a blade and a person because it was the right thing to do, and I was the person closest to the problem. I said I had stayed because the problem was larger than one night, and the work was not finished. I said I had gone to bring back what had been taken because it needed to be brought back, and I was the person who could go. I said that all of this was true, and all of it was simple, and all of it was the same thing said in different ways. I said that I had been asked, several times, in different rooms, by different people, to explain why I did the things I did. I said the explanation was always the same. I said, I am here because it was right to be here. I stayed because this became home. That is all I have. The chamber was quiet. The Empress began to applaud, slowly, deliberately, one motion, and then another, and the sound of it in that vast space with the open sky above was very clear. The court followed. It was not the sound of a human audience, because the Authori do not applaud in the human way, with the rapid successive motion. It was slower and more deliberate, each sound separate and considered, and the combined effect was something that moved through the chamber like a tide. I stood in the center of the room and let it happen, and tried to look less affected than I was. After the formal events were concluded, the reception moved to a space adjacent to the main chamber, and I spent approximately 3 hours in conversations with court members, coalition officials, and the diplomatic representatives of the allied species, all of whom had questions and observations and formal congratulations to deliver. I was patient with all of it. I said the right things. I asked the right questions. My authority held up, and when I moved to the common diplomatic language it held up as well, and at no point did I embarrass my species or my court or myself, which felt like a meaningful set of categories to be thinking of together. At the end of the evening, I found the balcony. It was late enough that the 3 moons were all up, in the configuration where they were roughly equidistant, which made the light they produced together the most even and clear it ever got. The city was still active below, because Authori cities did not sleep in the way that human ones did, but the activity was quieter than in the day, more spread out and deliberate. I heard footsteps. Valereth came to stand beside me. We stood there for a while without speaking, which had become, over 6 weeks, the comfortable thing. She said, eventually, that the ceremony had gone well. I said I thought so too. She said that the allied species representatives had been impressed. I said I hoped they had found it useful. She said that her mother had been pleased, though her mother would not express this in terms that made it easily legible. I said I had learned to read some of her mother's terms. She said yes, she had noticed that. A pause. The city below. The 3 moons. She said, do you regret it? I thought about what she was asking. The full scope of it. The blade and the medical room, and 11 days, and the court, and the case, and the document with 2 signatures, and the shuttle, and the asteroid, and the 16 days after, and the ceremony today, and everything that was now present in my life, that had not been present 6 months ago. I said, I regret that I did not see the blade 3 seconds earlier, so the whole thing could have been cleaner. She turned and looked at me. She said, that is a very Marcus Hale answer. I said, I have spent 6 weeks learning that that is apparently a specific category. She said, it is. I said, Valereth. She said, yes. I said, I am going to stay. She said, I know. I said, not because of the title, not because of the coalition assignment, not because of any of the formal structures. She looked at me, moonlight from 3 directions, and her expression was the open, clear one, the one that had been there on the floor of the hall and in the shuttle, and that she had stopped being careful about hiding. She said, I know why you are staying. I said, good. We stood there together for a long time, and the 3 moons moved overhead, and the city was quiet below, and somewhere behind us in the palace, the most important political structure in this region of the galaxy was doing what it always did, managing its vast and complex life across hundreds of worlds and thousands of years. In the morning, a transmission arrived. It came from the edge of human space, from a coalition monitoring station in the outermost ring of the mapped territory. The signal it had detected was new, unknown origin, no identified language, no identified technology. The human coalition's preliminary response was to forward the transmission to every allied entity for analysis. The Authori Stellar Court received the forwarded transmission and began its own analysis. The allied species received their copies and began theirs. I received a message from Colonel Webb that said, "We may need you on something. Can you be available?" I looked at the message. I showed it to Valereth. She looked at it. She raised one eyebrow, which on an Aethori was the equivalent of a significant expression. I said, "I am going to need a joint response team." She said, "I had already begun to consider who would be appropriate." I sent Webb a message that said, "Yes." He sent back, "Good. Details to follow. Stay where you are for now." I put the communication device in my pocket. The 3 moons were still visible, just barely, at the far edge of where the light was going. The day was beginning. I looked out at the horizon of an alien city and an alien star system under an alien sky, and I felt something that I recognized because I had felt it in every difficult place I had ever been. The specific clarity of knowing exactly where you are and exactly what you are supposed to be doing. The galaxy had not known what to make of us when we arrived. Humans, loud and fast and stubborn and difficult to predict, showing up at the edges of civilizations that had been running for millennia and disrupting the framework simply by existing. I had come here as a soldier sent to stand in the background and be decorative. I had stepped in front of a blade, and I had stayed, and I had built something, with my own 2 hands, and a lot of imperfect Aethori, and a 2,000-year-old empress who had decided I was either the most dangerous thing in the galaxy or the most necessary. She had told me she had concluded which. And now there was a signal from beyond the edge of mapped space, and a coalition that wanted a joint response, and an Aethori court that was already considering personnel, and a person beside me who had already started thinking about the problem before I had finished reading the message. The Queen had refused to let me go. I had stopped trying to leave. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. Neither did I, entirely. But I was very much looking forward to finding out.